The dust rises before you see the army. Not in clouds, but in a low, amber haze that clings to the horizon like smoke from a distant fire. You're standing on the ridge above the Jezreel Valley, and your throat is already dry from the heat, though the sun has barely cleared the eastern hills. Somewhere in that golden shimmer, 30,000 men are marching toward a narrow mountain pass that will decide the fate of empires. Most of them will never return home. The year is 1457 before the Common Era, and you are about to witness something that has never been recorded in human history, a battle so meticulously documented that 33 centuries later, we can still trace every desperate gamble, every tactical decision, every moment of terror as bronze met bronze and the world's first great conqueror rolled the dice on a strategy so audacious it would be studied in military academies until the age of gunpowder and beyond. The pharaoh's name is Thutmose, the third of that name. You wouldn't know it from looking at him in this moment, but he is 22 years old, and until 7 months ago, he was a shadow in his own palace, eclipsed by his stepmother Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled Egypt as king for 2 decades while he waited, trained, and seethed in ceremonial silence. Now she is dead. The circumstances remain murky even to historians like Peter Brand and Kara Cooney, who have spent careers analyzing the succession, and Thutmose has inherited an empire that doesn't yet know if he's a warrior or a pretender. The Canaanite cities along the Levantine coast sense weakness. They formed a coalition. Their leaders have gathered at Megiddo, an ancient fortress city perched on a rocky spur overlooking the same valley you're watching now, and they're betting that this young pharaoh will negotiate, pay tribute, or turn back. They don't yet understand that Thutmose has been waiting his entire adult life for this moment, and he has no intention of doing any of those things. The Egyptian records, carved later onto the walls of the Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak, tell us that the coalition numbered somewhere between 10 and 15,000 warriors. Modern historians like Donald Redford urge caution with ancient numbers, but the archaeological evidence from Megiddo's destruction layer suggests a substantial force. They came from everywhere the pharaoh's authority had slipped: Kadesh in the north, Tunip, Yanome, cities whose names are now dust but whose defiance in that spring carried the weight of revolution. Their leader was the king of Kadesh, a man whose name the Egyptian scribes refused to record, calling him simply that wretched enemy. He had turned Megiddo into a rallying point, and his strategy was sound. The fortress controlled 3 possible routes through the Carmel Ridge, 3 mountain passes that funneled like arteries into the Jezreel Valley. Block those passes, force the Egyptians to spread their forces or choose a predictable path, and the coalition could fight on favorable terms or simply wait while heat and supply lines did the killing for them. Thutmose's army is larger. The records claim 20,000 men, though some scholars like Kenneth Kitchen argue for closer to 10,000 effectives plus camp followers and supply personnel. What matters is composition. You're looking at the most professional military force the ancient Near East has yet produced. The core is infantry, Medjay warriors from Nubia, lithe and deadly with their copper-tipped spears, Egyptian regulars trained in formations that would have been familiar to a Roman legionary 15 centuries later, auxiliaries from Libya and Syria who fight for gold and plunder and the distant dream of Egyptian citizenship. Then there are the chariots. The chariots. Bronze-fitted, built from wood that flexed like living muscle, each one carrying a driver and an archer. Some accounts suggest Thutmose brought at least 1,000. They are shock weapons, prestige symbols, and mobile firing platforms all at once, and they represent wealth that most Canaanite cities couldn't match in a generation. But chariots need open ground. And Thutmose is staring at a problem. You can see it from where you stand, if you know what to look for. 3 passes cut through the Carmel Ridge. The southern route, the one circling wide through Karnak, is safe, predictable, broad enough for the entire army to march in formation without choking into vulnerable columns. The northern route through Zefti is nearly as good. Both would take an extra day, maybe 2, but they deliver the Egyptian army intact onto the plain below Megiddo, ready to fight. Every general in Thutmose's council is screaming for one of these routes. The scribes recorded the debate, and you can almost hear the frustration. How can we march on this narrow road, where horse must follow horse and man behind man? Our vanguard will be fighting while our rearguard still stands at Aruna. The enemy waits at Megiddo. They will laugh at us. The third route is the Aruna Pass. A hiking trail more than a military road, it cuts straight through the mountains, shaving perhaps a full day off the march. But it's narrow. Fatally narrow. The army would have to move single file in places, strung out for miles, unable to deploy, unable to defend itself. If the coalition realizes what's happening and sends even a fraction of their force to block the exit, the Egyptian army would be butchered in a defile with nowhere to run. It is, by every rational measure, tactical suicide. Thutmose chooses the Aruna Pass. The records give us his reasoning, and it's brutally simple. He knows the coalition expects him to be cautious. They've positioned scouts on the safe routes, prepared blocking positions, divided their forces to cover the likely approaches. They think they understand him, a young king, untested, advised by old men who remember his stepmother's peaceful reign. By choosing the madness of Aruna, Thutmose isn't just gambling on surprise. He's gambling that the king of Kadesh thinks like everyone else, that predictability is safer than audacity, that a 22-year-old pharaoh will listen to his generals. As military historian Richard Gabriel notes, what Thutmose understood, what would separate great captains from competent ones throughout history, is that sometimes the irrational choice is the rational one, if your opponent can't conceive of it. The army begins moving at dawn on the day we'd call late April, though they measure time by the flood season and the position of Sirius in the night sky. You watch them funnel into the pass, and even from a distance, you can feel the tension. The vanguard goes first, crack troops, the pharaoh's household guard, men who've earned their positions through blood and will die before they retreat. Thutmose rides with them. Not behind them, not in the safe middle of the column where a king should be, but at the front, visible, committed. The message is transparent: if this is a trap, I die first. The chariots come next, wheels scraping on stone, horses' heads tossing as they navigate terrain they were never designed for. Then the infantry, 20,000 feet tramping in a line that stretches back miles, their bronze-tipped spears catching the light like a river of fire flowing into the mountain's throat. Hours pass. The sun climbs. Inside the pass, the world narrows to rock walls and the back of the man in front of you. You can't see the sky properly. You can't see your flanks. Every shadow could hide archers. Every curve in the path could be the last thing you see before a rock slide or a volley of arrows transforms you from a soldier into a corpse. The psychological pressure is immense. These are professional warriors, but they're also human, and they're walking into what every instinct tells them is a killing ground. But no one comes. The coalition never blocked the pass. Maybe their scouts dismissed it as impossible. Maybe they couldn't believe Thutmose would risk it. Maybe, as Egyptologist James Henry Breasted suggests, the sheer speed of the Egyptian march caught them unprepared, their forces still dispersed between the other passes when Thutmose's vanguard emerged into the valley. Whatever the reason, as the afternoon sun begins its descent, the first Egyptian soldiers step out of the mountains onto the plain, and the Jezreel valley opens before them like a gift from the gods. In the distance, maybe 10 miles north, Megiddo rises on its tail, its walls catching the golden light. Between here and there, open ground. Room to deploy. Room to maneuver. Room for chariots to run. Thutmose has won the first battle without drawing a sword. The rearguard doesn't clear the Aruna Pass until darkness has already claimed the valley. You can measure the length of that column by watching torches emerge from the mountain mouth like a scattered constellation being born in reverse, pinpoints of fire that mark sappers, supply carts, the wounded who twisted ankles on stones they couldn't see, the men who simply stop to breathe because fear is exhausting and the human body has limits even when empires hang in the balance. Thutmose doesn't wait. He can't. Every hour the Egyptian army spends divided is an hour the coalition could recover from their shock, reposition, strike at the vulnerable tail still threading through the mountains. The vanguard pushes north along a streambed the locals call the Chinar Brook, and by the time full night settles over Canaan, Egyptian campfires are burning less than 3 miles from Megiddo's walls. Close enough to smell the city. Close enough to hear dogs barking at the sudden presence of thousands of foreign soldiers appearing where no army should have been able to appear. Inside Megiddo, you can imagine the chaos. Scouts arriving breathless with reports that make no sense. The Egyptians came through Aruna. Not around it, through it. The entire army. Chariots and all. The king of Kadesh has divided his forces between the expected routes, and now he has to make a decision with incomplete information and vanishing time. Does he pull everyone back into the city and endure a siege? Megiddo's walls are formidable, but sieges are slow deaths, and the coalition isn't unified enough to endure months of starvation while watching Egyptian engineers build ramps and siege towers. Does he march out immediately, try to hit the Egyptians while they're still disorganized from the march? That risks a night battle, always chaotic, always unpredictable, where superior numbers and positioning mean less than they should. He chooses to wait until morning. To gather his scattered forces, deploy properly, meet the Egyptians on the plain with the city at his back and his entire coalition united. Historians like Trevor Bryce argue this was sound thinking, avoid fighting on Thutmose's terms, force him to attack uphill if possible, use the night to consolidate. But it gives the Egyptians something more valuable than position. It gives them time. You're standing in the Egyptian camp now, and the atmosphere is electric with something that isn't quite celebration but feels adjacent to it. These men march through a defile that should have been their tomb, and they're alive. They're unified. They've watched their king lead from the front, and whatever doubts they carried about this young pharaoh who lived in his stepmother's shadow, those doubts are burning away like morning mist. Around the fires, soldiers are checking weapons with the methodical calm of professionals who know tomorrow brings killing but tonight brings rest. Chariots are being repaired, wheels checked, axles greased with animal fat. The horses stand in picket lines, their coats dark with sweat, eating grain that was carried through the mountains on men's backs because Thutmose understood that cavalry runs on fodder as much as courage. The pharaoh himself moves through the camp. The annals tell us this, though they frame it in religious terms, Thutmose making offerings to Amun, ensuring divine favor for the coming battle. But the effect is tactical. Soldiers see their king. They hear his voice. The social contract of ancient warfare is brutally simple: we die for you, you must be worth dying for. Thutmose is building that currency moment by moment, and when dawn comes, he'll spend it. The night is not quiet. You can hear the coalition army assembling in the darkness beyond the Egyptian perimeter, the rumble of many feet, the creak of wooden cart wheels, voices calling in Canaanite dialects and Amorite and languages that will be dead before Homer is born. They're forming up on the plain north of the Egyptian position, using the darkness and their knowledge of local terrain to deploy where they want to be, not where circumstances forced them. By firelight, you catch glimpses of their preparations. These are not savages or undisciplined militias. The Canaanite city-states have been fighting each other and the great powers for centuries. They know how to form a shield wall. They understand overlapping fields of arrow fire. Their chariots are fewer than Egypt's but still deadly, and their commanders have convinced themselves that numbers and defensive positioning can offset Thutmose's gamble. They might be right. War is never certain. The Egyptian army is tired from a forced march through mountains. Their supply situation is precarious. Everything they need must flow back through that narrow pass or be foraged from hostile territory. The coalition fights with their homes at their backs, defending the independence of their cities, while the Egyptians are invaders motivated by plunder and imperial prestige. Morale equations aren't always as simple as they appear. As military theorist John Keegan observed in his analysis of ancient battles, the army that feels it has no choice but to win often fights with a desperation that discipline alone can't match. Dawn comes slowly, the way it does in the Levant, a gradual bleeding of grey light into the eastern sky that turns to pink, then orange, then the hard gold of a sun that promises heat. You watch the valley reveal itself in stages. First the ground nearby, trampled earth and the debris of an army camp, broken straps, spilled grain, the dark patches where latrines were dug. Then the middle distance, where the Chinar brook cuts its shallow channel and reeds grow thick enough to hide a man. Finally, the far view, and there they are. The coalition army is deployed across the plain in a formation that would make sense to a Bronze Age commander. Their center is thick with infantry, spearmen mostly, standing close enough that their shields overlap, creating a wall of wood and leather reinforced with bronze bosses that catch the rising sun. The wings are lighter, more mobile, composed of skirmishers with javelins and slings who can harass the Egyptian flanks or fall back if pressed. Their chariots cluster on both ends of the line, ready to sweep around and envelop once the infantry lines engage. It's a defensive posture designed to absorb an Egyptian attack, wear down their momentum, then counterattack when exhaustion sets in. Thutmose sees all of this from his command position, surrounded by his generals and the scribes who will record what happens next for the temple walls. The records tell us he addresses his army, though they give us only the sanitized, ritualized version, prayers to Amun-Re, promises of plunder, reminders of Egyptian superiority. But you can imagine what else he says, what any commander would say before asking men to run toward other men who want to kill them. That they've already achieved the impossible by coming through the mountains. That the enemy is frightened, off balance, fighting defensive when they should be confident. That today they write their names into eternity, and the singers will still be chanting their deeds when their grandchildren's grandchildren are old. The Egyptian line forms in response. This is where you see the sophistication of New Kingdom military organization. The infantry deploys in divisions, each named for a god, Amun in the center, Re and Ptah on the flanks. They don't just stand in a mob, they form in depth, ranks behind ranks, so that when the front line tires or breaks, fresh men can step forward. The Medjay and other auxiliaries spread wide on the wings, their job to screen the flanks and prevent the coalition from doing to Egypt what Egypt plans to do to them. And the chariots are the chariots. Thutmose holds them back, a reserve of shock power waiting for the moment when commitment matters more than preservation. Between the two armies, perhaps 800 yards of open ground. Scrub grass and stones and the kind of terrain that looks flat until you try to run across it and discover every ankle-breaking divot and rise. No man's land. The space that will fill with the dying. Neither side moves yet. Both are waiting for the other to commit first, to reveal intention, to make the mistake that battle rewards and history remembers. The sun climbs higher. It's already hot. Inside armor, bronze scales sewn onto linen, or hardened leather cuirasses, the heat is suffocating. Men drink from water skins knowing this might be the last water they taste. Others urinate where they stand because leaving formation isn't allowed and fear does things to bladders. Thutmose raises his hand. The sound comes first. Not trumpets or drums, those come later, in other wars, other centuries. What you hear is simpler and more terrible, the collective roar of thousands of human throats releasing fear and rage and the desperate energy that comes from knowing you're about to collide with other human beings who want you dead. It rolls across the plain like thunder, and then the Egyptian line surges forward. Not running yet, that comes later, when distance closes and momentum matters more than formation, but advancing at a steady walk that eats the ground while keeping ranks intact. Shields up. Spears leveled. The discipline is extraordinary. These men have trained for this, drilled until muscle memory overrides the screaming voice in every head that says run, flee, anything but walk toward those weapons. The coalition line braces. You can see the front rank settle into stance, knees bent, shoulders hunched behind shields, spears angled forward to create a bristling hedge of bronze points. Behind them, the second and third ranks crowd close, pushing forward not yet with aggression but with their body weight, creating a human mass that the front line can lean back into when the collision comes. This is ancient warfare at its most fundamental, men pushing against men, the phalanx concept that won't be perfected by the Greeks for another 1,000 years but exists here in crude, brutal form. 400 yards separate the armies. Then 300. You can hear individual voices now, officers shouting orders, men calling to gods whose names will be forgotten, the sound of bronze rattling against bronze as thousands of soldiers adjust their grips, shift their weight, prepare for impact. The Egyptian advance accelerates. Still not a run, but faster now, eating the final distance, and you can see the moment when training and discipline begin their inevitable war with terror. Some men in the coalition front rank step back involuntarily, pushing into the men behind them. Some lean forward too far, breaking the line's integrity. These are the micro-fractures that kill armies before swords ever touch flesh. 200 yards. The coalition archers loose. The sky darkens. It's a cliché because it's true, because hundreds of arrows launched simultaneously actually do create a shadow, a momentary eclipse of wood and feather and death. The Egyptian line contracts slightly, shields rising overhead without breaking stride, and you hear the multiple impacts like hail on a roof. Bronze arrowheads punch through leather, stick in wooden shields, skip off bronze armor with sounds like struck bells. Men fall. Not many. Ancient archery is less lethal than Hollywood suggests, as military historian Adrian Goldsworthy notes in his studies of pre-gunpowder combat, but enough. Gaps appear in the Egyptian ranks. The men behind step forward automatically, filling the holes, and the advance continues. 100 yards. The Egyptians begin to run. This is the terrifying part, the moment when formation threatens to dissolve into mob but doesn't quite, because these are professionals who've practiced this transition until they can do it bleeding and terrified and still maintain enough cohesion to hit as a unit rather than a scatter of individuals. The roar intensifies. The ground shakes, you can feel it through your feet, the drumming of thousands of sandaled feet pounding earth. The coalition archers fire again, faster now, panic shooting that trades accuracy for volume. More Egyptians fall. More gaps appear. The rest keep coming. 50 yards. Both sides are screaming now, wordless and primal. You can see faces, mouths open, eyes wide, the universal expression of men about to do violence. Some are crying. Some are already dead inside, running on pure momentum because stopping is more dangerous than continuing. Some few, the veterans, the killers, the men who've discovered they're good at this, wear expressions of something like joy. 20 yards. The coalition front rank locks shields, a wall of wood and bronze and human flesh that looks impenetrable until you remember that every wall is made of individual men, and men break. 10 yards. Impact. The sound is nothing like sword fights in films. It's blunt and wet and wooden all at once, the crunch of shields slamming into shields, the thud of bodies colliding, the immediate screaming of men who've been speared in that first terrible moment when momentum drives bronze through whatever it finds. The Egyptian line doesn't pierce the coalition formation so much as compress it, both armies smashing together and then locked, pushing, grunting, dying in the space of a few horrifying yards where combat becomes wrestling, becomes murder, becomes survival, stripped of everything noble or clean. You're in it now, or as close as you can be without actually dying. The man next to you, Egyptian, maybe 20 years old, a farmer from the Delta who joined the army because it pays better than barley, takes a spear thrust under his shield rim. You watch the bronze point emerge from his back, slick with blood that looks black in the harsh sun. He doesn't fall immediately. He stands there, confused, trying to understand why his legs won't work anymore, and then someone behind him pushes forward and he goes down and is trampled because the living can't stop for the dead, not here, not now. The coalition line holds. This is their moment, the defensive posture paying dividends as the Egyptian momentum exhausts itself against prepared positions. In places, the Egyptians are actually pushed back, stumbling over their own dead, and you can see coalition officers screaming encouragement, sensing possibility. If they can break the Egyptian center now, force a rout, Thutmose' gamble becomes his tomb. The Canaanite spearmen push forward, grinding into the Egyptian formation, and for long minutes, 5, perhaps 10, time becomes fluid in combat, the outcome balances on the edge of chaos. But Thutmose hasn't committed everything. The Egyptian wings are still fresh, and they begin to curl inward, applying pressure on the coalition flanks. Not breaking through yet, but threatening to, forcing the coalition commanders to thin their center to reinforce the sides. It's the beginning of the envelopment that will define this battle, though nobody knows it yet. They're too busy trying not to die. The chariots haven't moved. On both sides, they wait behind their infantry lines, and you can feel the crews watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when infantry combat opens enough space for wheels and speed to matter. A chariot charge into dense formation is suicide. Horses won't willingly crash into a wall of men, and even if you could force them, you'd just create a target for every spear in reach. But if the lines break, if gaps appear, if fear creates openings where courage closes them, that's when chariots become death incarnate. The sun climbs higher. It's mid-morning now, and the heat is vicious. Inside the press of combat, men are cooking in their armor, sweat mixing with blood until everything is slick and the grip on your weapon keeps slipping no matter how tightly you clench. Thirst becomes torture. The wounded who can't escape the combat zone are crushed or trampled or simply bleed out while the battle rages over them, and their screaming adds to the cacophony that military chaplain and historian SLA Marshall would later describe as the furnace of battle, a sensory overload so complete that most men remember it afterward only in fragments, snapshots, moments of clarity surrounded by fog. The Egyptian center is struggling. You can see it in the body language, in the way the front ranks lean back slightly instead of forward, in the increasing number of men going down and staying down. The coalition king of Kadesh, watching from somewhere behind his lines, might be starting to believe. Might be thinking that Egyptian discipline and superior numbers aren't enough, that defending your homeland creates a kind of strength that imperialism can't match. Might be imagining his name carved into victory stele while Thutmose becomes a footnote, the pharaoh who gambled and lost. And then Thutmose releases the chariots. Not all of them. Never all at once, that's the amateur's mistake, committing reserves before you know where they're needed. But a significant force, perhaps 300 vehicles, sweeping wide around the Egyptian right wing where the coalition line has been weakened by the need to reinforce their center. The ground there is flatter, better for speed, and the Egyptian charioteers have been waiting for this moment since dawn. They burst forward in a wedge formation, bronze-fitted wheels throwing up dust, and the sound of their approach, the thunder of 1,200 hooves and 600 wheels, carries a psychological weight that transcends their actual killing power. The coalition left flank sees them coming. Sees them and panics. Because here's what ancient infantry knew in their bones: you cannot stop a chariot charge by standing still. Either you scatter and break formation, or you hold and get trampled, and your brain makes that calculation in the seconds before impact. Some men run. Some freeze. A few brave or foolish souls try to engage, stepping forward with spears raised, and are simply crushed or bypassed as the chariot wave flows past and then curves back, the archers firing point blank into now disordered troops who can't maintain shield walls while dodging horses. The coalition flank doesn't collapse immediately. Collapse in ancient warfare is a process, not an event, a gradual dissolution of cohesion that starts with individuals and spreads like infection through a formation. But it begins. And once it begins, it accelerates. In the center, the Egyptian infantry feels the pressure ease. The coalition line, forced to contract to deal with the chariot threat, loses its density advantage. Egyptian spearmen find breathing room, recover their formation, and begin pushing forward again with renewed energy that comes from sensing victory within reach. The battle's momentum, that intangible but real force that determines ancient combat more than tactics or technology, begins to shift. The collapse, when it comes, is not a clean break but a hemorrhage. You watch it spread through the coalition line like a stain through fabric, first the left flank where the chariot struck, then the soldiers adjacent to them who see their comrades fleeing and feel their own resolve crack, then the men behind them who can't see what's happening but feel the pressure change, the forward momentum reversing into something that might be retreat or might be rout or might be that terrible space between the two where armies die. The king of Kadesh screams orders that maybe 10 men can hear over the roar of combat and the thunder of Egyptian chariots that are now ranging freely behind his line, cutting down runners, shooting arrows into exposed backs, transforming organized withdrawal into panicked flight. Here is what you need to understand about ancient warfare: once men start running, they usually die. Not might die, usually die. Because the moment you turn your back on an enemy, you expose everything vital. No shield protects your spine. No armor covers the backs of your knees. And the men chasing you are filled with the kind of savage joy that comes from hunting prey that can't fight back. The Egyptian infantry pursuing the coalition left doesn't maintain formation anymore. They don't need to. They're killers now, individual predators picking off the slow and the wounded and the simply unlucky, and the ground behind them is littered with bodies in postures that speak of desperate final moments, men who stumbled, men who turned to fight and were overwhelmed, men who simply stopped because exhaustion is as deadly as bronze when you're running for your life. The coalition center holds longer. These are the elite troops, the household guards of the major cities, men who fought before and know that discipline is the only thing standing between them and the slaughter consuming their flanks. They begin a fighting retreat, backing toward Megiddo in something resembling order, shields locked, jabbing at any Egyptian who gets too close. It's professionally done, and if the rest of their army had maintained the same composure, they might have made it back to the city walls intact. But warfare is a system, and systems fail when parts fail, and the coalition's parts are failing catastrophically. Thutmose commits the rest of his chariots. The Egyptian center opens deliberately, creating corridors, and through these gaps come the remaining chariot squadrons, perhaps 600 or 700 vehicles, the largest concentration of mobile striking power the ancient world has yet seen deployed as a single tactical unit. They don't charge the coalition center directly. That would be wasteful, grinding down against troops still capable of resistance. Instead, they sweep wide, racing past the flanks, and begin cutting off the retreat routes to Megiddo. It's envelopment on a scale that won't be seen again until Hannibal surrounds the Romans at Cannae a millennium from now, and the tactical sophistication on display suggests that somewhere in the Egyptian command structure, maybe Thutmose himself, maybe one of his veteran generals, is a mind that understands warfare as geometry, as mathematics, as the art of being everywhere your enemy isn't prepared for you to be. The coalition realizes, too late, that retreat to Megiddo might be a trap. The city gates are open, yes, but the road to those gates is now a killing ground where Egyptian chariots hunt in packs and every 100 yards brings fresh horrors. Some coalition soldiers try to scatter into the surrounding countryside, hoping to reach smaller settlements or simply disappear into the hills. Most of these will be hunted down over the coming days by Egyptian patrols. Some try to make a stand in the open, forming desperate shield rings that the Egyptians simply bypass, leaving them isolated and irrelevant while the main action flows past. And some, perhaps a third of the coalition force, make it to Megiddo's walls in a disorganized mob that has stopped being an army and become a crowd of terrified men trying to squeeze through gates designed for orderly traffic. You're watching from the walls now, or imagining you are, and the view is nightmarish. The plain before the city is carpeted with the dying and the dead, with abandoned weapons and shattered chariots and horses screaming in the particular way horses do when they're wounded and don't understand why. The Egyptian army advances like a tide, methodical now, the killing frenzy giving way to the practical work of securing victory. They're not trying to break into the city, not yet. They're content to surround it, to trap the coalition remnants inside, to let fear and hunger do work that siege towers and rams would accomplish more expensively. The gates close. They have to. There are still coalition soldiers outside, pounding on bronze-reinforced wood, begging to be let in, but the defenders can see Egyptian chariots approaching and they know that open gates mean the city falls today instead of someday. So the gates close, and the men outside die, and inside the walls you can hear weeping mixing with recriminations as city leaders who were allies this morning begin the process of deciding who to blame for the disaster that just unfolded. Megiddo is not a small city. The archaeological evidence, as synthesized by Israel Finkelstein and others who've excavated the tell, suggests a population of perhaps 4,000 in the late Bronze Age, with room for substantially more during sieges when surrounding villages took refuge behind the walls. But now those walls contain not just the usual inhabitants but the remnants of a coalition army, maybe 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers who escaped the battlefield but brought nothing except their wounds and their terror and their mouths that need feeding. The city's granaries were stocked for a long siege, but not for this many people. Not for an army and a city trying to survive together. Thutmose doesn't assault the walls. He doesn't need to. His army establishes a siege perimeter that night, close enough to prevent sorties but far enough to avoid the harassing fire of slingers and archers on the walls. Egyptian engineers begin constructing a circumvallation, a wall around the city, earthwork and timber, designed not to get in but to keep the defenders from getting out. The message is clear and terrible: time is now Egypt's weapon. The Karnak inscriptions tell us that the pharaoh addresses his troops again, praising their courage, distributing captured loot, and making it clear that the men inside Megiddo are already dead men, they just don't know it yet. Inside the walls, the coalition leadership fractures. The king of Kadesh, whose name the Egyptians refuse to record and whose fate remains uncertain, faces a rebellion from the other city leaders who followed him into this catastrophe. Some argue for immediate surrender, offering Thutmose tribute and submission in exchange for their lives. Others insist on resistance, hoping that the Egyptian supply situation will collapse or that another coalition will form in the north and relieve the siege. The Megiddo City Council, watching their stored grain being consumed by frightened soldiers who never wanted to be here, begins its own calculations about survival that don't necessarily include loyalty to Kadesh or anyone else. The siege lasts 7 months. Let that sink in for a moment. 7 months of slow starvation, of watching children grow thin, of making impossible decisions about who gets the dwindling food supplies, of diseases that flourish when too many people occupy too little space with inadequate sanitation. The Egyptians wait. They've built a supply line back through the Aruna Pass, and ships from Egyptian-controlled ports along the coast bring grain and wine and everything an army needs to sit comfortably while the city dies by degrees. Thutmose uses the time productively, sending raids into the surrounding territory, accepting the submission of smaller cities that see which way the wind blows, transforming tactical victory into strategic dominance. The end comes not with a dramatic assault but with negotiation born of desperation. The city gates open sometime in late autumn, the records give us the date in Egyptian calendar terms that scholars like Donald Redford translate to roughly November. The coalition leadership emerges under terms of surrender so complete they barely qualify as terms. They hand over their weapons, their armor, their chariots, their horses, everything of military value. They kneel before Thutmose and acknowledge Egyptian sovereignty, promising tribute in perpetuity, grain, timber, precious metals, whatever the pharaoh demands. Some of the leaders are taken back to Egypt as hostages, insurance against future rebellion. Others are allowed to return to their cities as Egyptian vassals, their independence transformed overnight into dependence. The plunder is extraordinary. The Karnak inscriptions give us an accounting that reads like an quartermaster's fever dream: 924 chariots, 2,000 horses, 200 suits of armor, the personal chariot of the king of Kadesh worked in gold, thousands of cattle and goats, grain stores sufficient to feed the Egyptian army through winter. Modern historians urge skepticism about ancient numbers, but even if we discount by half, this is wealth on a scale that transforms Egypt's strategic position overnight. The pharaoh who gambled everything on an impossible march through an impossible pass returns home with proof that audacity pays better than caution. But numbers don't tell the story. You need to understand what this victory means, what it sets in motion. Thutmose III will campaign in the Levant 17 more times over the next 2 decades, but none of those campaigns will face the kind of unified resistance he met at Megiddo. The coalition broke there, not just militarily but psychologically, and the lesson was learned by every city-state from the Sinai to the Euphrates. Egyptian power under this pharaoh is not something you challenge. You accommodate it, you profit from it if you can, you survive it if you must. The empire that Hatshepsut built through trade and diplomacy, Thutmose expands through systematic, professional military conquest, and Megiddo is where that transformation becomes irreversible. You're standing in the temple of Karnak 10 years after the battle, and the stone under your fingers is still warm from the afternoon sun. The wall before you is covered in hieroglyphs that tell the story you just witnessed, though filtered through the lens of Egyptian propaganda and religious symbolism. Thutmose appears in the carved reliefs as a giant striding across the landscape while his enemies scatter like insects. The gods watch approvingly, particularly Amun-Re, to whom the pharaoh attributes all credit for the victory. This is how Bronze Age empires remember warfare, not as chaos and terror and men screaming for mothers who will never hear them, but as divine theater where mortal kings act out cosmic dramas of order defeating chaos. But beneath the propaganda lies something real and historically transformative. The Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE is not just the first battle in history documented in tactical detail, it's the template for a new kind of warfare that will define the Late Bronze Age and echo through military thinking for millennia. What Thutmose demonstrated on that dusty plain was that audacity combined with professional military organization could overcome superior defensive positions and numerical parity. The gamble of the Aruna Pass became a case study that commanders from Alexander the Great to Napoleon would recognize. Sometimes the irrational move is the correct one precisely because your enemy can't conceive of it. The immediate aftermath reshapes the Levantine political landscape. Within 2 years of Megiddo's fall, every major city between Gaza and Kadesh has acknowledged Egyptian overlordship. This isn't always voluntary. Thutmose spends those 17 subsequent campaigns crushing rebellion, punishing cities that test Egyptian resolve, and establishing a network of garrisons and loyal vassals that will maintain Egyptian hegemony for nearly a century. But the brutality is strategic, calculated to make the cost of resistance so high that submission becomes the rational choice. As historian William Murnane notes in his study of Thutmose's military campaigns, what emerges is not just an empire but an imperial system: tax collection, tribute schedules, garrison rotations, diplomatic protocols, that transforms conquest into administration. The wealth flowing back to Egypt from these conquests is staggering. Gold from Nubian mines that are now secure from northern threats. Timber from Lebanese forests that will build the ships and temples of Egypt's golden age. tribute in the form of exotic animals, precious stones, skilled craftsmen, and enslaved prisoners who will labor in the quarries and construction projects that make Thutmose's reign synonymous with monumental building. The economic impact reverberates through Egyptian society, a growing middle class of military officers and administrators, flourishing trade networks that connect Egypt to the Mediterranean and Mesopotamian worlds, an artistic renaissance funded by imperial profits. But zoom out further, past Egypt's borders, and you see Megiddo's influence rippling outward in ways Thutmose could never have anticipated. The battle establishes patterns of conflict that will characterize the Late Bronze Age international system. The great powers, Egypt, Hatti, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, spend the next 2 centuries fighting proxy wars in Syria and Canaan, supporting local rulers, switching allegiances, using the small city-states as chess pieces in a grand strategic game. The Amarna letters, those cuneiform tablets discovered in an Egyptian archive and deciphered by scholars like William Moran, give us glimpses of this world, local kings writing desperately to pharaohs, begging for military support against rivals, promising loyalty, offering tribute, all operating within a framework that Megiddo helped establish. Thutmose himself becomes something more than a king. He rules for 54 years total, though most of that is split with his stepmother Hatshepsut's regency. When historians like Betsy Bryan analyze his reign, they find a leader who systematically built upon Megiddo's success, not just militarily but administratively, religiously, culturally. He reorganizes the army into a professional standing force rather than seasonal levies. He establishes a cult of military victory where successful campaigns are commemorated not just in temple inscriptions but in annual festivals that bind the Egyptian populace to imperial success. He promotes based on merit rather than birth, creating a class of career soldiers and administrators whose loyalty is to the pharaoh personally rather than to local nobility. The irony is that Thutmose's greatest battles after Megiddo are often anticlimactic. The psychological victory won on that plain in 1457 means that subsequent campaigns frequently end with cities surrendering before fighting begins. The king who gambled everything on impossible odds becomes the king whose reputation makes gambling unnecessary. By the end of his military career, Thutmose has expanded Egyptian control further than it has ever reached, up to the Euphrates River, where he sets up a boundary stela and claims dominion over lands that would have seemed impossibly distant when he was a young prince living in his stepmother's shadow. And yet, as historian Nicholas Grimel observes, empires built by conquest face an inevitable problem: they require continued conquest to maintain themselves. The warrior king who expands borders creates expectations, economic dependencies on tribute, military careers that need wars to justify their existence. Thutmose's successors inherit his empire but not always his competence or his luck. The sons and grandsons who follow him will fight to maintain what he conquered, and some will succeed while others watch portions of the empire slip away. The Battle of Megiddo doesn't create a permanent order, it creates a temporary supremacy that lasts until the next great shift in power. That shift, when it comes, will be dramatic. The Late Bronze Age collapse, beginning around 1200 BCE, will destroy the entire international system that Megiddo helped establish. The great empires will fall or contract catastrophically. The trade networks will collapse. The cities will burn. Historians debate the causes: climate change, systems failure, migrations of sea peoples, internal rebellions, some combination of everything, but the result is undeniable. The world that Thutmose knew, that Bronze Age cosmos of chariots and tribute and imperial correspondence, will vanish so completely that later Greeks will remember it only in myths of heroes and monsters. But the battle itself survives in memory and in military theory. When Hellenistic generals study warfare, they study Egyptian campaigns. When Roman tacticians discuss strategy, they reference the principle Thutmose demonstrated, that mobility and surprise can overcome static defense. The accounts preserved in Karnak become source material for historians from Herodotus onward, each generation reading their own lessons into that ancient gamble through the mountains. Even now, military academies around the world teach Megiddo as a case study in leadership, in the calculated risk that defines great captains from competent ones. You're standing on the tell of ancient Megiddo now, or rather, imagining yourself there, because the actual site is an archaeological park in modern Israel where tourists walk on boardwalks above excavated ruins. The Jezreel Valley below looks peaceful, agricultural, crisscrossed with roads where the ancient armies marched. There's no trace of the blood that soaked into this earth 33 centuries ago, no echo of the screaming, no shadow of the thousands who died here in service of kings whose names mean nothing to the farmers working the fields below. Time has buried everything except the story. And that's what remains, in the end. Not the empire, which eventually fell. Not the plunder, which was spent or stolen or lost. Not even the reputations, because who outside of academic circles thinks about Thutmose III when they think about great conquerors? What remains is the story itself, preserved in stone and transmitted through generations, of a young king who gambled everything on a mountain pass that should have killed him and emerged on the other side to find that fortune really does favor the bold, at least sometimes, at least once, at least on that particular morning in late April when dust rose on the horizon and an army appeared where no army should have been able to appear. The Battle of Megiddo teaches us something about human conflict that remains true across every technological age. Warfare is ultimately about will, about the capacity to endure uncertainty and risk everything on decisions made with incomplete information in moments that won't come again. Thutmose had better training, better equipment, better organization than his enemies. But what won the battle was his willingness to do what no reasonable commander would do, to lead from the front through terrain that could have trapped and destroyed his entire army, to commit fully to a plan that existed on the knife edge between genius and suicide. Every battle since has been a variation on that theme. The generals who win are the ones who see the opening others miss, who calculate odds differently, who understand that sometimes the most dangerous choice is the safest one because your enemy has already prepared for everything else. The empires that endure are the ones that institutionalize that audacity, that build systems capable of executing impossible plans, that transform individual brilliance into organizational competence. But empires always fall. Systems always break. The wheel keeps turning, and the dust rises on new horizons where new armies march toward new impossibilities. Somewhere right now, someone is making Thutmose gamble in different circumstances, with different weapons, betting that speed and surprise and the sheer force of will can overcome defensive positions that look impregnable until someone refuses to believe they are. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they die in mountain passes with their names forgotten. Sometimes they emerge into valleys that open before them like gifts, and the world shifts, and history records another impossible victory that becomes inevitable only in retrospect. The sun is setting over the Jezreel Valley, painting the sky in colors that Bronze Age soldiers would recognize, orange and red and purple, the same light that fell on Megiddo when the gates closed and the siege began and an empire was born from audacity and blood and the willingness to walk through mountains that should have been impassable. Tomorrow the sun will rise again, and the valley will wake to tractors instead of chariots, to commuters instead of armies, to peace that feels permanent until history reminds us that nothing is permanent except the story itself, echoing forward through time, teaching its lessons to anyone willing to listen. This is how the first recorded battle in history ends, not with final victory, because there are no final victories, but with the understanding that warfare is the human condition made visible, and that every age must learn the lessons again because the price of forgetting is measured in ruins and broken empires and dust rising on horizons where armies march toward futures they cannot see. The story continues. It always continues. And somewhere in the distance, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the sound of bronze meeting bronze, of men screaming, of chariots thundering across ancient ground where the dust never quite settles and the dead never quite finish teaching the living what it means to gamble everything on the choices that define us.